ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. The NATO Military Committee Conference is taking place in Prague with the attendance of the defense chiefs from 32 member nations. This three-day summit will focus on threats, NATO's eastern flank, and the future of the alliance's capabilities, including artificial intelligence. And another key topic is NATO's evolving role in Ukraine with the launch of the Joint Analysis Training and Education Center. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the significance of this event is Mark Toth, a national security and foreign policy expert. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. Good to see you, Benjamin.
So can you help us understand how significant is this NATO Military Committee Conference for the alliance's strategic direction?
Benjamin, at a high level, it's very strategic. It basically is in three phases. There are three sessions that will be happening. There's the first session that was where they're implementing what was decided upon in Washington back in July. And it's a symbolic year as well, given that it's the 75th anniversary of NATO. And so they're taking what the heads of state decided to do and what they want to see happen and starting to put that in place, shape that into a process, if you will, that reaches down to each and every command that comprises NATO across Europe. The second part of it, which will be led by the U.S. General Christopher Cavioli, who's the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, is kind of what's known as the DDA family of plans. And for people not familiar with that lingo, what that means is the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And that crosses a lot of different domains. It looks at those domains from a regional standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, and from a contingency standpoint. And those domains are ones that are familiar to anyone that's kind of covered military security, which is on air, land, maritime, cyber, space, and special ops. And so that third session, which is kind of what you were talking about in the lead-in year, is also what kind of lessons can be learned from this past year in NATO and have those filtered down into NATO training as well, and including the establishment of a new command, the JTAC, as you mentioned, which will be this organization or this command structure, if you will, that integrates more closely Ukraine into NATO philosophy and training and so forth.
All right, so it does seem like a lot is going on here. How do you think the creation of this NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis Training Education Center impact Ukraine's defenses?
It's important. Then when you get to the battlefield, it's much about logistics. It's much about the seamless transfer of weapons and munitions onto the battlefield. And if you're using disparate systems, if you have different methodologies, if you have different ways of fighting war, that all can create delays for those type of things getting to the battlefield and being effective once they're there. By streamlining that, by making sure that Ukraine is on the same page as NATO over time, that's a good thing. And likewise, because this is sort of a shaping operation, if you will, at the NATO Military Committee meeting, it's also NATO adjusting to what Ukraine has been learning on the battlefield itself. And making sure that NATO is adapting to that as well. So uniquely in this setting, whereas before this was kind of a one-way street, NATO deciding what it needed to do better, this is actually a two-way street now where Ukraine can actually provide real-time info that they've gained and learned from their fight against Russia.
Right, you mentioned that the session took place after the Washington NATO summit, which shaped the direction of these summits going forward. How would you assess its achievement when it comes to the NATO military alliance from Washington, D.C. to now? Do you think that the direction is generally heading the right way, or were there any calibrations that were needed during this time that were talked about during the summit?
Right. It's important to remember that this is a planning session in terms of what's going on in Prague, and that this is what they're going to be looking for their commands to implement based on what was decided in Washington. Now, from my perspective, the way that I view it, I think Washington should have gone further. I think there should have been a more immediate pathway for Ukraine into NATO, and not just to have these things happening tangentially, such as the JTAC on the side. But it is what it is, right? And so that's what needs to go forward. So from my standpoint, I can't fault this individual committee. That's not their decision. That's the head of state's decision. but I think it could have been more effective in that regard. But there's a lot to do here. And I think of late, as we know in the past few days, Putin has thrown somewhat of a curve here by once again threatening war with NATO. So I'm sure that will infuse a lot of the conversations with what they need to be learning and what they need to be preparing for in each of those individual commands that make up NATO all over Europe.
Right. You mentioned that this summit is mostly about implementation of what took place, what was discussed in Washington. But a lot of discussions now revolving around whether or not these Western allies will allow Ukraine to use these long-range weapons provided by the West to strike inside Russia. Do you think that this meeting will come to any conclusion, or at least push this decision to a direction of some sort of conclusion?
Right. Ben, it's a great question. It's the million-dollar question, as I often say on TVP World, because this committee does have an ultimate goal, which is to give recommendations back to the political leadership. And I think one of those has to be that attack on Storm Shadows, the Taurus missile from Germany. They all need to be in play. Russia has got an unfair advantage at this point. It's able to attack Ukraine from a distance, and in two areas, both in terms of defense, in terms of bombers, et cetera, getting through to target Ukrainian civilian centers, population centers, energy and oil type centers. They've got this unfair advantage. The other side of it, though, is even on the offensive side of the warfare, which is creating that space behind the front lines so that ultimately Ukraine can start to maneuver forward, be it in the Donbass or further towards the south. So definitely a lot on their plate, definitely a lot to digest in, and for them to be able to move forward with.
Right. There's also another topic that I would like to pick your brains on, because recently we've seen a flurry of diplomatic offensives when it comes to a discussion with Kyiv. We saw diplomats from all across Europe heading to Kyiv with talks with Zelensky. Do you think that this might indicate perhaps a sign of a potential peace negotiation with Russia underway, or do you think this urgency have anything to do with potential outcoming change of leadership in the United States?
Yeah, Ben, I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. I think if we step back, Putin is not interested in any kind of peace, at least a long-term peace. He might take a quick deal, just as he did in 2014, but make no mistake, he's going to start up again, and he wants all of Ukraine. I think Ukraine sees that very clearly and is not interested either. And so I think you hit it on the head in your questioning of me, is that this is more about the uncertainty right now that's being created in the United States by not knowing who's going to be the president come January. And at this point, at least from my perspective, I don't see either candidate yet. Obviously Trump during the presidential debate earlier this week was unwilling to commit to Ukraine winning. So that was deeply disappointing. Likewise, though, Kamala Harris, I apologize, was not willing to commit either to a winning strategy. She still seems stuck on the defend for as long as it takes, which is not going to result in anything good for Ukraine. So I think a lot of these peace feelers, these discussions, what Olaf Scholz has come out with in Germany and the like, people that have been traveling to Kiev, I think people are trying to find ways, but I don't think it's going to be fruitful in any meaningful way.
All right, and speaking of the presidential candidate tickets, J.D. Vance has just came out with some really strong statement when it comes to Ukraine, saying that Ukraine needs to, retains its independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join some other allied institutions. And this is what the deal is ultimately going to look like. So do you think that if Trump's ticket actually does go through, that might pose a threat for Ukraine's independence, or at least a peace talk on its own terms?
Ben, it's a fair question. I don't do politics, so let me qualify that up front. But I will say very clearly that J.D. Vance just has it wrong. One, you don't reward Putin for invading a country. And the way his so-called peace plan starts is by fixing the lines along the borders as they are now. Now, obviously, Putin's not going to accept any kind of peace deal that involves Ukrainian troops maintaining control of Kursk, for instance. But equally likewise, neither is Zelensky going to cede parts of the Donbass or Crimea back to them as well. So J.D. Vance, just to be blunt, is very misguided in that basis. And in the long term, unless Ukraine is an active part of NATO and an active member, not just part, but a full-fledged member of NATO and a full-fledged member of the European Union, then Ukraine's security is going to be at risk going forward, as will ultimately the security of Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states.
All right. Going back to this NATO meeting, because you just mentioned also something I think very crucial, that Ukraine's experience can be drawn as a lesson to likely integrate into the NATO doctrine. What are some of the things that maybe NATO can learn from the war that's happening in Ukraine to better prepare itself against threats like Russia?
Right. Ben, perfect question again. There's a lot to be learned because it's one thing to fight war theoretically in terms of exercises and the like. And I really think back to the United States back in the 1980s and late 1970s even, where they learned a lot from the Israeli military in terms of using U.S. weapons in real combat situations, platforms such as the F-15 and the like, and the modifications that the Israelis did on those, especially in the electronics area. Ukraine's allowing for the same thing to be happening now in terms of that learning curve for NATO. We've seen where some U.S. drones have been deficient. Ukraine's been able to adapt to that. We've seen some weaknesses in the way that warfare is being fought right now. In terms of U.S. tanks, Ukraine has been showing how those can be bridged and gapped and those tanks made more effective. So there's a lot that the West can be learning. And that's what's key. This center that's being created in Poland, in your country, is all about ensuring that information is transferred back to NATO and that NATO can learn from and adapt for it. And certainly that's one big part of the agenda. That's what the third session is all about in this conference, is making sure that those lessons are learned and then applied in each and every command and in each and every domain.
All right, last but not least, what's your perspective on NATO's future in terms of both deterrence and its support for Ukraine?
Ben, NATO will remain strong. It's only gotten stronger. I know there's been a lot of people out there claiming that Putin somehow can weaken it. That's not going to happen. Putin's actions to date have only strengthened NATO, as evidenced by the accession of Finland and Sweden, and they're only going to get stronger. They're learning how to fight a war that, in my estimation, overall, Putin is losing. He's maybe winning a little bit of a war of attrition, but he's losing at a strategic level, and he's been shown to have basically a paper army. And in that regard, NATO gets to learn a lot. So I think NATO comes out stronger from this. I think their ability to deter Russia is more secured. And I think they just have to not fear Russian escalation threats, just as recently as Putin was saying, hey, if these long-range weapons are introduced into the side of Russia deeper than what they're currently going at, he's going to consider them at war. NATO doesn't need to fear that. NATO's posture is strong right now. Putin's posture is weak. He doesn't want to pick a fight with NATO. That's just all bluff, all kabuki theater. So I'm very positive and upbeat on the future of NATO.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks again for being with us on TVP World. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Ben. Take care.
Take care. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.